Good day. Welcome to another wonderful webinar hosted by JBR Academy. My name is Zander. I'm a registered industrial psychologist in JBR Psychometrics, and I'll be co-hosting this wonderful session on using the Matrigma in a corporate context. My colleague, Kirsty, is a registered psychometrist and very knowledgeable about the topic. She'll be the main host, and I'll be interjecting here and there to make it more of a discussion. We hope you enjoyed. Kirsty, looking forward to the talk.
Thanks, Sander. Lovely to have you here and lovely to be here to give you guys a little bit more of an overview of the Matrigma. So let's kick off and get this session going.
Yeehaw.
Lovely enthusiasm. Thanks, Sander. So just over the course of the next hour or so, what we will be looking at is relating to the Matrigma. We're going to have a quick look at the background to intelligence testing and looking at general mental ability, a brief overview of the tool, the Matrigma itself, how you'd go about administering it, how you'd go about interpreting it, and then also just touching on some of the South African research, which is obviously incredibly important in any context, but specifically in ours. So let's get started. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this model. And also have an understanding that intelligence is probably one of the most published and researched topics in psychology, and also brings with it huge amounts of debate and differences of opinion, how we define it, how we measure it, so on and so forth. I'm not going to dwell too long on the history though, all the differing opinions, all the various debates around intelligence, but rather pick up where Charles Spearman entered the scene, and introducing his concept of a two-factor theory of intelligence, where we have general intelligence as well as several more specific factors. He proposed that each measured factor is actually made up of two components, a general one and a more specific one. So this could potentially be something like verbal ability, numerical ability, spatial or mechanical ability, as you can see on your screens now. This model also proposes that there is some sort of an overlap between the specific intelligences as well as the general mental intelligence. Spearman's general factor, or the G factor, has been very topical, and it's also been criticized quite widely. But empirical studies have shown that this G factor is in fact exhibited in all types of tests that you would or potentially include in some sort of a cognitive test battery. And it has also been found to be generalizable in all test batteries, regardless of which factor model is used. And the G factor can be found everywhere that problems need to be solved.
Maybe, if you don't mind, if I interject, because I'm very interested in the history. And for those folks like me, I know Kirsty said she wants to skip over it, but I'm going to hammer on it. So for those of you not interested, please bear with me. So as you know, we talked about Spearman, who was a great proponent of the general factor, or G. But just for those of you who don't know, the other individual were Thurston, and he was more a proponent of multiple factor theory. And he identified 7 primary mental abilities, which I'm not going to go into. But the point is, for a long time, there was heated debate between proponents of Spearman's general factor G and Thurston's multiple factors. And, well, which is sometimes great is it doesn't have to be an either or, and you can have the best of both worlds. And fortunately, academics came to a conclusion that these things, you can have a general factor G that consists of different separate abilities that still load on the general factor. So, and that's been proven through second order factor analysis or higher order factor analysis and bifactor analysis in research. And we can say that there is something like G, but we don't have to refute the fact that it consists of various different subfacets. So important to note, we can have the best of both worlds. You can have your cake and eat it.
Sander, thanks very much for fleshing that out. I appreciate it. But so basically, we can rest assured that G factor is out there. The next question is, how best to measure it? It is present in all types of problem solving, your verbal, spatial, or numerical assessments all ultimately measure some aspect of G factor. And factor analysis that has been done has shown that all items, regardless of type, so it could be a numerical, a verbal, or a spatial item, any type item that challenges a person's ability to see hidden connections, fill in gaps where information is missing, grasp the relationship between different objects, and finding points of similarity among figures that differ from one another are the best types of items to capture or to tap into this G factor. So these items are based on both inductive and deductive problem solving, and they do require a person to be able to manipulate symbols, words, or numbers mentally into a logical whole. So these are the kind of items that are best going to measure this elusive G factor that we're wanting to tap into.
Light bulb.
Exactly. So this is very different from pure knowledge items, such as memorizing vocabulary or memorizing your multiplication tables, which would rather measure an aspect of learnt ability. And studies do suggest that these kind of items, the ones that measure a learnt ability, are considerably worse as a measurement of this G factor. So it's items that are going to tap into those problem-solving abilities, those looking for the connections, filling in the gaps, that are going to be best suited to tapping into G.
Sorry, just back to the history again. Kirsty, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but Cattell, perhaps years after Spearman's G, said that it could be split into two distinct aspects, namely GF, which refers to fluid intelligence, and GC, which is learned or crystallized intelligence.
Absolutely.
Would it be correct to say that this could be something like fluid intelligence, what the Matrigma measures?
Absolutely, 100%. You hit the nail on the head. You're giving away the happy ending, but no, definitely. Okay. So the Matrigma is going to tap into that fluid intelligence, okay. 100%.
So we'll touch base on that again.
We'll have a look at that in a moment or so.
Thank you for indulging me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. So now the question is, why all the fuss about this G factor or general mental ability? Well, there's a very good reason for all of this fuss. Research has very clearly shown that general mental ability tests are by far the most cost-effective and also the best way to predict how people will perform in the workplace. And particularly if you are in having to make hiring decisions, this becomes incredibly important. Studies have suggested that high-performing individuals can generate as much as 4 times the output of an average employee. So you are wanting to pull in the best candidate for the job. You are wanting to select those high performers. And if you're wanting to do so, general mental ability assessments are certainly a good starting point. So for those of you that have been following these Lunch and Learn webinars, I'm sure you will have, or hopefully remember, or be able to think back to moments when both Yanni and I have mentioned the study that was conducted by Frank Schmidt and his colleagues, where they conducted a meta-analysis on all published validation studies, largely in the US. And these studies described the correlation scores on general mental ability tests and job performance. And the initial study was conducted in 1998. It was updated in 2006. And in both cases, it was shown that your general mental ability tests are out and out by far the best predictors of job performance, with the most recent study showing operational validity of general mental ability tests at 0.65. And then further to this, studies have also gone on to show that this finding holds true in all types of professions. So it can then be generalizable for all different types of work, which makes it an incredibly useful tool to use in predicting job performance and getting the best people in for the job. Even further analysis went on to examine whether or not the complexity of work, of a work assignment, had a moderating effect on the predictive power of general mental ability assessments on work performance. And it was found that even in the least complex professions, your GMA tests were still able to predict job performance. This predictive power did increase with the complexity of work assignments, and you can see this on your screens right now. This table was taken out of the technical manual, and a lot of the information we are going to touch very briefly on is expanded in the technical manual. So I strongly recommend downloading it, reading through it, and getting a much more solid grounding on the assessment. But just generally speaking, the general predictability of your GMA tests has been estimated at 0.39 for the least complex professions, which you can see here on your screen in front of you, and 0.73 for your most complex professions, which links really well to the fact that you are probably, when you're going to be using assessments in selection settings, you are generally wanting to pull in your high performers. And you can see from this table that with the higher complexity work assignments, the predictability does go up, and it is quite comforting to see that it is 0.73 for those individuals. But even so, for professions of average complexity, where in all honesty, the largest numbers of workers tend to actually be active, the predictability is still estimated at 0.66. So in a nutshell, the G factor or GMA predicts job performance across all professions, and the effectiveness of testing this G factor increases with the complexity of a profession. Another angle that was also considered in the research that was done was what might happen to the predictability when someone has learned their job. And this is something that you certainly would need to consider. But studies in this regard do suggest that the predictability of the G factor does not necessarily decrease as work experience increases. And work experience does not have nearly the predictability of a GMA test in terms of predicting an individual's job performance. A very low estimate that is suggested is that your GMA tests are around 200% more effective at predicting job performance compared to an individual's work experience. So the question is, why are you not using it in your battery? It certainly is a really useful tool to consider in your assessment toolbox.
Kirsty, if you don't mind, I just want to really highly recommend that you'll see that Schmidt is an article often cited. He's a reputable academic, and for those of you who are more interested in the field of personnel psychology and how things predict particular outcomes in the workplace, you can Google Scholar that particular name and look at other related articles for similar and also very interesting topics.
Thanks, Ada. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so now moving on to, now that we've set the scene, we've created a nice background from which to launch from, just introducing the Matrigma. It is an assessment that has been developed by a Swedish company, Assessio, and it has been designed with the express purpose of measuring general mental ability. It is a non-verbal assessment. The individual is presented with 35 items where they need to identify patterns and logical sequences. The assessment is timed, so bear this in mind. There are only 40 minutes for your individual to complete all 35 items. The test items are in the format of matrices, and the non-verbal format makes it a lot less susceptible to cultural differences among individuals. So it does make it a really useful tool to be using in our context. And we will get into a little bit more detail around the South African research a little bit later. So hang in there for that. The problem-solving tasks are presented in order of increasing difficulty. So this means that the greater progress that the individual makes as they go through the assessment, the harder the tasks will become. Not everybody necessarily completes the assessment, although the developers do feel that 40 minutes is a fair amount of time to complete all 35 items. Once the assessment, once the 40 minutes is up, the assessment it stops, results are saved, and then the report does get generated. You do need to be a psychologist or a psychometrist to use this assessment. It is a restricted assessment. It has been designed and developed for use in individuals 18 years and older, and it is intended for a normal population. There is training available, but it's not compulsory. Provided you are a psychologist or a psychometrist, you have access to the assessment without the training. If you are interested in training, you're more than welcome to contact JVR Academy and find out a little bit more about that. Today's webinar is not an official training, it's just an introduction to the tool, but it is there if you feel that you need a little bit more. All right, so as I've mentioned, the Matrigma it's a psychometric assessment. It is used to measure cognitive ability, namely fluid intelligence, and its purpose is to predict job performance and also career success in individuals. What it measures more specifically is the fluid intelligence that we chatted around a bit earlier, Zander. It has a look at an individual's ability to quickly identify patterns and logical rules, also taps into their abstract logical reasoning and problem-solving ability. By measuring these things with an individual, you can then get an indication of where they score, and you're able to predict an individual's work performance. You're also able to predict an individual's learning ability and effectiveness at their job. And also you get an indication of how comfortable or how well a person will be able to deal with new information as well as unfamiliar situations. Why would you want to use something like this? Well, as we've mentioned and covered a little bit earlier, and you are more than welcome to read up in a lot more detail, it is a powerful predictor of an individual's job performance. It also offers a good understanding of a candidate's results. It is universally applicable. It can be generalized, so a result can be generalized to all types of jobs in any number of work industries. And as we saw earlier with the table, having a look at assignment complexity, it is incredibly useful to indicate how well an individual will be able to handle high complexity jobs as well.
And I can imagine with this booming of the information age, and now even with the fourth industrial revolution, a lot of people are going to have to kind of make sense of a lot of unknown things in their jobs, irrespective of what you are. So
yeah.
Having the general mental ability to handle this complexity could be extremely useful.
No, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's so much talk about this VUCA environment, the fourth industrial revolution. Companies need to be agile, innovating, entrepreneurship. They're all buzzwords at the moment. And without a shadow of a doubt, being able to handle complex assignments, being able to deal with new unfamiliar information is going to become more and more critical in candidates that you're wanting to bring into your organization if you're wanting to thrive in this new uncertain environment that we're moving into. Right. So where would you use the Matrigma? Well, you would definitely use it in selecting candidates into the workplace. Please note, it is absolutely not suitable for development purposes, and it's not for use in a clinical context. It has not been designed for that. So I don't need to stress it more. It's really, really only suitable for selection purposes. It's applicable for any position in all industries and businesses. It has been recommended, so if you do read through the technical manual, which I'm sure everybody is going to do when they start using the assessment.
Please do.
It has been described as best suited as a first step in the selection process, so almost as a screener. And to be perfectly honest, it is cost effective enough to be used in that purpose as well. If you're going to be using a hurdle approach in your selection process, it is definitely a great place to start, but it certainly has been used by many of our clients very effectively as part of a larger battery, giving an indication of an individual's general mental ability. If you're wanting to use the Matrigma at some stage going forward, it is available on the JVRO platform. So what we would do is we would create a JVRO platform for you. You will automatically have access to the Matrigma. It is not available in a pen and paper format, so you do need to scope the situation quite well. If there is an incident and electricity goes down, you don't have internet connectivity, you won't be able to use the Matrigma at that point. So just bear that in mind. Once we've set up a JVRO platform for you, what you would then do is go in, you'd create a project, you would select the Matrigma as the assessment that you're wanting to include. You would send out the link, and then your candidate is able to complete the assessment that way.
Kirsty, we often assume that once an assessment has been validated, and obviously then it consists of it should consist of good psychometric or sound psychometric properties.
Yes.
But we often negate the importance of standard administration practices in psychological assessment.
Absolutely.
And even if you're doing an assessment like this online,
yes,
still important to follow best practices to ensure that a standard environment is set where people complete the assessments, to make sure that those are not strenuous variables. For example, an internet connection that might be a problem that could influence how people answer questions on something sensitive like a cognitive ability assessment.
Yeah.
So just that's something that's very important to bring back home for candidates, to make sure that they do it in one sitting and that they're comfortable and at ease and well rested. That information should still be communicated, even if it's via email, to make sure that these standard practices are followed and that the assessment is used in the best, and the person has the best possible chance to perform on the assessment and show his best ability on it.
100%, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think that is so important, particularly as more and more assessments do go online. And it's something that practitioners do need to consider if they are going to administer assessments, any assessments, not specifically with the Matrigma. But as soon as you are going to be sending out links for candidates to complete them remotely, it is so important to consider, how do you communicate that? How do you ensure the conditions are standardized? How do you ensure that it's the individual you're hoping that's going to complete it on the other side, and that they are aware that they need to be completing any assessment in the best possible conditions. So with 100%, thanks for raising that. It's so important.
We won't be going to specific guidelines, but we can recommend people like the International Test Commission or institutions like that, or there's some phenomenal resources out there with best practice guidelines on what to do with
Absolutely. And we'll cover it very, very briefly, more just as a reminder. But it is an important point to remember and to consider. So once we've set up your JVR online platform, you'll see our design team has created a fantastic job here. But you would then go online, create the link, and then send it out. Okay, ideally, and following up on what Xander and I have been discussing, ideally this assessment needs to be administered under supervision. There is absolutely the functionality where you can send out the link and you can have an individual complete it without being there supervising it. But very interestingly, the manual does go into that, and they do recommend that it is administered under supervised conditions. And they go on to say that if the respondent has completed the Matrigma unsupervised, it is strongly recommended that the respondent is retested under supervised conditions, or that the test score is supplemented with results from an additional GMA test. And I agree with that 100%, for exactly the reasons that we've already discussed and mentioned. You cannot, despite emails, despite phone calls, despite your best intentions, you cannot be 100% certain, one, that your required individual has in fact completed it and didn't get a friend of theirs to do it for them. And you also don't know, we've had incidents on live TV where broadcasters have their family racing in the middle of a live, political broadcast on international television. We can't guarantee that if you are completing it at home or at the office, that you're not being distracted every 3 minutes. So I think general rule, it needs to be administered under supervision. Once your candidate has, under supervision, completed the assessment, the reports will then automatically be generated, particularly if you have set it up on your JVR platform for reports to be generated immediately. If you choose not to, then absolutely you're able to go in on the system and manually generate the reports. But for all intents and purposes, as soon as either the 40 minutes are up or the candidate clicks submit, the reports are available to view or tap into, and they will be emailed to you as the practitioner. Absolutely, under no circumstances will they automatically be sent to the candidate. And ideally, when you set up your project, you will keep the email addresses to be sent to as yours. All right.
Good to always put yourself in the candidate's position. How would you feel if you didn't receive proper feedback on an assessment? The sensitivity around cognitive ability.
Absolutely.
So it always helps you to put yourself in the candidate's position, understand what the sensitivity of it and what the implications are of not following best practice guidelines around.
No, absolutely. And I think now's a really good time. Let's have a look at a couple of those. Let's look at a little bit more detail what you need in order to administer the assessment, what you'll need just to consider, and then also go into a little bit more detail into what you as a practitioner also need to provide to your candidate. Okay, so a 40-minute time frame. This is a timed assessment, as I've mentioned previously. So the candidate needs to set aside that amount of time. You also need to, when they come in to complete the assessment, need to communicate that to the candidate. They don't want to suddenly get a shock that the whole system has now done the 40 minutes and the time is up and it closes itself down. So the time limit is automatically applied by the web system. So even if the respondent hasn't completed all 35 items, the system does end the session and the report gets generated. Another thing that you also need to consider is your candidate needs to have a basic reading comprehension. So yes, absolutely, this is a nonverbal assessment, but all the instructions that are needed for the respondent to complete the test are available. They're on the screen throughout the testing process. And although the language is simple and it is straightforward, you do just need to ensure that your candidate is able to read and understand the instructions nonetheless. So they do need that basic level of reading comprehension. You also need to ensure that your candidate doesn't necessarily have any impairments that could make the process a lot more difficult for them, or could give them an unfair disadvantage, as it were. So just to check that there's no perceptual, no visual, no cognitive impairments that could hinder your candidate. You've mentioned this, and we have touched on this, but you need to ensure that the client is in a non-distracting environment. It needs to be a quiet place. You can't have people in and out. You can't have telephones ringing. You can't have someone popping in and out. Just remember, this is a timed assessment. There's a limited amount of time, and the tasks do get increasingly harder and harder. Your candidate needs to be able to concentrate and focus as much as possible. So this is also why conducting the assessment under supervision is so important, because in an environment that you can control as a practitioner, you can then ensure that it is going to be a suitable environment. Because absolutely, it would not be appropriate for someone to sit down in an internet cafe and complete the assessment. In the car or on the bus or in the taxi on the way to work is, again, absolutely not suitable at all. You need a very quiet, non-distracting environment. And then also, quite importantly, your candidate does need to have basic computer skills. So you need to know that they know how to operate a computer, they know how to move a mouse, they know how to work it, just in order and that also takes one less stress for them to consider. You can imagine if they're constantly worrying about how to use the computer, and now they're still needing to have a look and try and identify the patterns, try and solve the problems with all of this going in on the background.
Yeah, I mean, you want to measure what you purport to measure, which is general mental ability, not somebody's computer skills or their ability to deal with distractions.
100%.
And those are both strenuous variables that can influence what you're measuring.
Absolutely.
So make sure that those conditions are suitable to measure what you purport to measure, not some strenuous or noise outside that, 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 that,
An internet connection, obviously this is going to be quite important. If there is no internet connection, you can't access the assessment, you can't be doing it. So do just ensure that this is available, and also a stable internet connection. It does become slightly problematic if you're halfway through the assessment and suddenly you lose signal. And then also, very importantly, you do need a personal computer, be it a laptop, be it a desktop. This assessment is absolutely not recommended for use on tablets or phones. And this is just quite important to communicate, and just also as a practitioner, just important to remember, because in this day and age, so many people do everything on their phone. And often the assumption when you send out a link, or when they access an assessment, that they can do that on their phone as well, or on a tablet, and it really, really isn't suitable. The system does not have the functionality for you to see the assessment as well on these devices. So please, desktop or laptop is the assessment. You do need that full-sized computer screen for the candidate to complete the assessment. Okay. So again, just to highlight the kind of things that you do need to remember as a professional, and a lot of this can be contained or captured in your consent form that you're going to use with your candidate, get them to sign before they start the assessment. It is essential that your candidate understands the purpose of the testing. They know why they've been called in, they know what is going to be happening with the results of this assessment, they know why they are being assessed. Also, over and above that, they need to know the purpose of this specific assessment. So they need to know what kind of assessment the Matrigma is, what those results mean to a certain extent, and how they're going to be used. That's just absolutely best practice. So they also need to understand or know how the Matrigma will be administered. They need to be aware that it is going to be a computer-based assessment, and then at that point they can, if there are any issues, they can mention, perhaps they're not as competent or comfortable with a computer, and then as a practitioner, you'll need to assess that situation quite carefully. They also need to understand and know how the results from the assessment will be used, who's going to use them, and then also they need to, how long those results are going to be held onto, how long they will be used for. I mean, it really wouldn't necessarily be fair if 10 years down the line you pull out these results and use them for the client. So that kind of information needs to be communicated. And again, it doesn't necessarily, if you have all of that information in your consent form, because a lot of this is generalizable to most assessments. So it is just something that you can consider. And this is actually quite a nice template that you could use if you are struggling to put together a consent form. With the greatest of pleasure, please use this information and then flesh it out. They also need to be aware, and it needs to be a voluntary process. Obviously, there are consequences if a candidate chooses to stand up and not do the assessment, but they do need to know that that is an option if they feel that they need to. Also, and again, this is generalizable to all assessments. Feedback is, people are entitled to feedback on their assessments. How that feedback is provided, who pays for the feedback, that's a whole different discussion, and that can be decided between you and your client at some stage. But if a candidate asks for feedback on their results, they are entitled to that feedback, and that is just something that you need to consider. How are you going to go about offering that, billing it? Just a bit of a logistical something to think about.
Important just to think it through.
Yeah, and have the answer beforehand,
Yeah.
so that you don't get caught on the back foot, perhaps, if suddenly thrown a question you hadn't considered. So now that you have very ethically, best practice, administered the assessment under supervision, obviously, at this point, once the candidate has completed the assessment, 2 reports can automatically be generated if you've set JVRO to that way. So it can generate the report automatically. There are 2 reports that are generated for you as the practitioner. There is an interpretive report, which will be your report. That's the report that you will use in putting together your integrated report, or whatever it is, or making decisions, or assisting decision makers in making decisions. And then there is also a your result feedback report. And this report is available for the candidate, you can give this to the candidate. Interestingly, the Matrigma have created this feedback, this Your Result feedback report, as a report that can be sent on without personal feedback, and they do mention that in the technical manual. My feeling is still very much that you need to handle all feedback on psychological assessments personally and interactively with. I still feel very strongly that despite it being mentioned that you can send it on without personal feedback, I do think it is really important as the practitioner to rather do it. I feel that that's a best practice, so a better way to do it. So just in terms of the results, they are presented on a standard scale, and this scale is a C scale. I'll show you in the next slide a table that has a look at it in a little bit more detail. So your C scale ranges from 0 to 10 C scores, and it has a mean of 5 and a standard deviation of 2, so slightly different from the STEM that we're probably more comfortable or more familiar with. So in order to facilitate the interpretation of the test scores, the C scale has been divided into 3 levels. So the 1 will be considered below average. So these are any scores ranging from 0 to 2 C scores. Your average results are reported as anything ranging from 3 to 6 C scores. And your above average results would be considered anything ranging between 7 to 10 C scores. The candidate's result is based on a comparison against a norm group, as with most, if not all, psychological assessments. And then we can infer from the results that your individual will have either more of, less of, or similar levels of an ability in comparison to others. And important for you to know, and for us to let you know, that we do have South African norms for the assessment. We have conducted research in the South African context. So when you use the assessment on JVRO, you are using a South African norm group. So that's something just to remember. So the characteristics measured by your Matrigma are the ability to find logical, sometimes hidden connections, conduct abstract reasoning, make logical conclusions, and then also solving novel problems. And this ability will vary between individuals. It's also, these abilities are also really, really important in a work context. So generally speaking, you can make the interpretation or make the inference that a higher score on the Matrigma means that your candidate is more likely to exhibit a higher level of job performance, whereas lower scores will indicate that this individual is less likely or they will struggle and not necessarily exhibit as good job performance.
Kirsty, just out of curiosity, say in a particular pool that you're selecting from,
yes,
you typically have people from average to lower type of scores on the Matrigma.
Yeah.
What then? And you have to select from those individuals. What would be the potential practical implications?
Yeah, it would need to be a decision that would need to be made. But I think going back to your actual job profile and the needs of what an individual would need to be able to do for that job. So honestly, I think in situations where the work assignments are highly complex, I think it would probably be more problematic for this individual. But absolutely, I think you would need a fuller battery. So I think as a starting point, you wouldn't make one decision based on this one assessment. It would certainly go a long way to helping with the decision-making process. But studies do suggest that things like conscientiousness can also play into that. And interestingly, they do also mention it in the report as well, specifically in the Your Results report. But conscientiousness would also indicate whether or not the person would be able to, it would probably take them longer to get to a point where they're able to function more comfortably. But that could certainly be a mitigating factor. You would just need to take into account if an individual is working in a highly complex environment, fast-paced, fast-moving, and their scores are lower. Even with higher levels of conscientiousness, you would still need to consider, is there the possibility of putting a framework in place or boundaries or a lot of support, a lot of almost having a recipe that they could follow. which to an extent, the whole point is that you don't want someone following a recipe, you want them thinking on their feet. So you as the practitioner would need to take a lot of evidence into account and decide, whether or not they are a suitable fit, or whether or not you might need to, maybe go back to the drawing board and have a look for more candidates. But certainly, and I think the point that you raised is so important, that as important as the results on this assessment are, it's not the only point of reference that you will use. You will also need to have a look at, and hopefully you have selected a variety of other suitable assessments that are going to tap into important or competencies that are required of a specific job.
Thanks.
So no, thanks for bringing that up. That is an important consideration. So just very quickly, and again, you can access this table in your technical manual. Hopefully, I'm dropping plenty of seeds that are going to ensure that you race out and download your technical manual to read up more. But if you have a look here, it just gives you an overview of the C scores. And then also just in terms of, it gives you a look at the percentile margins as well, just to give an indication of where the individual is going to fall in comparison to the population. So we can see here quite nicely that individuals who would be scoring at around a 7, they're going to fall, form part of the, give or take the top 20% of your population. Individuals who would be scoring a 2, for instance, they're going to be falling into the bottom 4% of the population. So it just gives you a nice indication of where people will be falling on the curve, and you can see how the C scores would relate back to that. So there we go. All right. So as I mentioned previously, you do receive 2 reports. It's the absolute bargain. Buy one, get 2, 2 for the price of 1. But there are 2 types of result reports for each candidate that you can get. There is an interpretive report, and this is intended for the test administrator. This report is going to contain information about the respondent C scores, have a look at the level wherein they scored. So this level will be defined as a low, an average, or a high score. And then it also gives a slightly more in-depth account of what your results mean. And you will get a description around what the results mean in terms of general mental ability. So you can see here on your screen at the moment, there you have the results for Joe's sample. You can see what his actual score is. There's, in terms of the curve, you can get an indication of where he's going to fall. You'll also see right at the bottom of your page, you can see over here where the arrow is pointing, that your low scores are going to comprise the 16% of individuals who achieved the lowest results, and these scores will fall between 0 and 2. Your average scores are going to indicate 68% of the norm group, which is what we know anyway. And these are the scores that would fall between 3 and 6. And then your high scores are going to comprise the top 16% of the population, and these are the scores that would fall between 7 and 10. The other report that you are going to also receive, and this is the report that can be given to the candidate. My feeling is very strongly with feedback as well. And this is going to be a far more condensed amount of information for the candidate. And it just has a look. You'll see it talks a little bit, well, quite briefly about what the Matrigma is going to tap into. It has a look at the candidate's results. So here you can see on the example, this candidate did incredibly well, received a high result. And then there's some narrative for your candidate around what this result actually means, just in terms of work and job complexity. And what I really like about this report is if you have a look at the bottom section, and this also speaks a little bit to what we were discussing a little bit earlier, that for your candidate, just to remember that when reading their results, they do need to bear in mind that it is significant for job performance, but there are also other characteristics that would be significant in a work context. So here, they do mention conscientiousness to an extent, but also they also speak about other things, the extraneous variables that you mentioned, Zander. So disturbances during the test session, misunderstanding the instructions, not being genuinely motivated. These are factors that could potentially have, messed with the results, possibly, and then also just something to consider. And yeah, as potential mitigating factors, and if need be, to contact the administrator or the practitioner if need be. Just in terms of interpreting the results, candidates with a high score, generally speaking, I've mentioned these scores will fall between 7 and 10. You can infer that these individuals with the higher scores, they are going to easily solve problems that do require a person to have a logical deductive ability. They will also probably familiarize themselves with their work tasks really, really quickly, and they are in all likelihood going to perform at an above average level in all kinds of jobs. They are going to manage well in complex jobs, particularly the kind of jobs that are going to make a great demand on their problem-solving ability. They are very likely going to be perceived as being very efficient than people with lower test scores. And then here they speak specifically, if they can also display conscientiousness in their job, they'll probably prove to be an asset in an organization. And this text that I've been sharing with you is taken directly off the interpretive report. So they do speak to that as well. In terms of, just also another thing to consider with a high score, if you do have a candidate who does have a higher score, you'll see that they do need the challenge, they do need the problems to solve. And you may find that if you bring an individual like this into a less complex environment, where there is a lot of recipe following, very little, a lot more churn and very little problem solving, there's a very high chance that this individual is going to get really bored. So again, something to consider, with all results, highs and lows in certain situations, can be good and bad. So always to bring your results, to interpret your results within the necessary context. And then just in terms of individuals with an average score, these would be scores that range between 3 and 6. They would have an average ability to solve problems that require logical deductive ability. So they'll probably familiarize themselves with their work duties at a fairly normal pace, much like everyone else. And they're going to perform at their work at medium levels in most kind of jobs. They manage well in jobs that make average demands on their problem-solving ability. So here, potentially, things like higher conscientiousness will be of value and assistance in getting them further, making them appear more efficient. But your average scores, these are going to speak to 68% of the population and going to be like most of us.
Think of Locke and Nathan's work. Maybe just also, any general person could benefit from setting both difficult and challenging goals that are realistic, but just pushes you a little bit, given that level of general mental ability.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And then with the lower scores, so these candidates will score between 0 and 2, and be aware that they are probably going to find it hard to solve problems that require logical deductive ability. They'll need somewhat longer time to familiarize themselves with work duties. They're likely to perform below average in most kind of jobs, and they're certainly going to manage less in more complex environments. They're going to require a lot more experience, a lot more training, a lot more guidance, support in performing their duties or becoming familiar with their duties. And again, certainly in certain environments, this is exactly what you do need. You need someone who is, who will very comfortably, very happily, once they're comfortable with the recipe, be able to follow it. But they will need the guidance and support to get there. So there might certainly be instances where these kind of scores are what you're looking for. Right. Okay, let's have a look. So hopefully by now you are fairly convinced that this is a really, really good assessment to add to your battery. And now you just need a little bit more information around how it's going to work in the South African context. So we have conducted research, we have developed norms, we have looked at all the items. And generally speaking, the overall psychometric properties were found to be good, and the assessment is appropriate for use in the South African context. Again, this is now taken from the South African supplement. So again, this is available for download and some good bedtime reading. But you will be able to see from this table that reliability coefficients for the different Matrigma forms are good, and we're quite happy with that. Just as an aside, when we talk about the 5 different forms, the assessment is not adaptive, but what would happen is if your candidate went on to complete the assessment and then went on to complete a second version, they're not going to see the same assessment again. So the options that are given to the candidate are randomized, so it can pull from either A, B, C, D, or E form. This obviously would just try and mitigate any test wiseness or issues around that.
Just for those who are watching the table on the far right-hand side, you'll see that there's a coefficient reported that we're not often familiar with, Gutman's lambda. And it's important to know that alpha sometimes, as a reliability, underestimate in non-homogeneous groups. And that's why lambda was also reported. However, in this case, you'll see that there's not a substantive difference between the coefficients and that they look in general on par.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can see from this table that the Matrigma did show good reliability across all 5 forms. And then also, if you go in and read in a lot more detail, it also showed good reliability for specific subgroups within each sample as well. There were no statistically significant differences between how participants scored on the different forms of the Matrigma, which is good to know. There were, however, some statistically significant differences between how people from different age categories scored, with younger participants scoring higher than older participants. But we know this from our understanding of fluid and crystallized intelligence, and it is what one expects anyway. So the assessment is just reflecting what studies are suggesting around intelligence and how it plays out in the different age categories. Also important to know and be confident with, there were no statistically significant differences between how men and women scored on the Matrigma. Although there were statistically significant differences between how white and black participants scored on the assessment. And then this is just something that you do need to keep in mind when interpreting results. Black participants did score significantly lower than both the Asian, Indian, and the white participants. So as a practitioner, you do need to have a look in a lot more detail at the South African research, have a look at the studies, and then again, bear this in mind when interpreting the results. So yeah, just generally speaking, over and above that, sorry, I do need to mention, the assessment has been submitted and it is on the HPCSA list of classified tests. So again, having a look at the psychometric properties, knowing that the assessment is on the list, as a South African practitioner, you can use the assessment with confidence. Absolutely.
If I can interject,
yes, please.
We're all familiar with the development of psychometric assessments in the past. And it's highly important that the cross-cultural validity of assessments are determined. And fortunately, we've done this research. And for those who are more interested in the technical part, we've done a RASH analysis as well. And with RASH analysis, we've not only inspected the item fit, but we've also looked at the differential item functioning between various different groups, which included age as a category, gender. And I'm not going to go into all the categories, but that was inspected.
Okay, no thanks, Sander. That's awesome. And again, the technical manual is available. It can be downloaded off the JVRO platform. So it's there for you guys to read up on, to be comfortable, to be familiar with using the tool confidently in your workspace going forward. So I think that's us for today. We've hopefully managed to interest you, keep you engaged over this last session. It's been fantastic being able to spend the time with you, so thanks very much.
Kirsty, I think this was a phenomenal webinar. Brought some grand insights, and I think just some stuff that we already know, but sometimes it needs to be repeated and reaffirmed, even among the most seasoned practitioners. And there was also some valuable information provided on this assessment of general mental ability. We highly appreciate it. Thank you for the time taken. Great.
Thanks very much.